Imagine a black woman slave coming from her master's room during the night. She is crying and sobbing, but no one can help her. She has been continuously abused by her white master, and his white wife knows that as well. It becomes disturbing to know that this black woman is pregnant, but this is not stopping the white master from exploiting her. Seeing her own suffering, the black woman slave makes a tough choice. She knows if she allows her baby to come into the world, the baby will also face brutalities. Therefore, it's better to do mercy and save the baby from more suffering. She would then commit the most painful act, taking the life of her own infant while it is in her belly. Records of such incidents exist, but that's not it. What brutalities she was saving her baby from? In this video, let's learn about the most chilling and disturbing things done to black slaves during slavery. These are the things you will never learn about in schools.
The Black History Archives.
Number 1. Cutting ears for insurance. During the height of the transatlantic slave trade, the relentless greed for profit turned human lives into mere commodities. For ship captains transporting enslaved Africans, even death became an opportunity to cash in. These captains saw the enslaved not as human beings, but as cargo that could be bought, sold, or disposed of at will. If an enslaved person died on the route due to illness or harsh conditions, insurance companies often refused to pay out. To get around this, captains developed a gruesome tactic. They would cut the ears of deceased slaves to prove they had been thrown overboard. This horrifying practice was a way to satisfy insurers, showing that slaves were discarded not due to natural causes, but supposedly to lighten an overloaded ship. One of the most infamous examples of this cold-hearted cruelty was the Zong massacre in 1781. Captain Luke Collingwood, commanding the British slave ship Zong, ordered the mass drowning of over 130 enslaved Africans in the Atlantic Ocean. He stated that the ship was allegedly running low on water. But historians have since revealed a far more sinister motive. If the enslaved individuals had died on board due to sickness, the insurance would not cover the loss. However, if they were thrown overboard, it could be claimed that the act was necessary to save the ship and crew, making it an insurable event. Many slave ships were intentionally overloaded from the start of their voyages. Captains and traders knew full well that their ships could not safely carry the weight of so many people, but this was a deliberate part of their plan. The strategy was chillingly calculated. By cramming in as many enslaved Africans as possible, they ensured they would have a surplus. Midway through the journey, captains could then lighten the load by throwing a few slaves overboard and claiming it was necessary to prevent the ship from sinking. This allowed them to file insurance claims, thus profiting from the deaths of those they had never intended to deliver alive. What's even more disturbing is that many of the enslaved people captured for these voyages were chosen with the grim knowledge that they were meant to be discarded along the way. These individuals were never intended to reach their destination. This cold calculation showed the utter dehumanization of Africans in the eyes of their captors, who viewed them as disposable assets to be used and discarded for financial gain. Number 2. Infanticide as an act of mercy. In the brutal reality of slavery, some enslaved black mothers made a heart-wrenching decision that few can imagine. They chose to end their own children's lives to spare them from a future filled with suffering and bondage. For these mothers, this tragic act was seen as the only mercy they could offer, a desperate attempt to prevent their children from enduring the horrors they knew all too well. In their eyes, death was a kinder fate than the brutality of slavery. Furthermore, this was done as a sign of resistance that black women would no longer provide slaves, which fueled the economies of the white households. One of the most painful and documented cases of this tragic act is the story of Margaret Garner, an enslaved woman in the United States. In 1856, when faced with the threat of being captured by slave catchers, Margaret chose to kill her 2-year-old daughter rather than let her be dragged back into a life of enslavement. Confronted about her actions, Margaret reportedly said that she would rather her children die free than live in chains. Her story was so profound that it later inspired Toni Morrison's powerful novel, Beloved, which delves deep into the psychological trauma that drove her to such a decision. Furthermore, oral histories collected in the 1930s by the Works Progress Administration reveal heart-wrenching stories of enslaved mothers who, in their despair, saw infanticide as the last act of control they had over their children's fate. They knew that allowing their babies to live meant condemning them to a life of forced labor, abuse, and inevitable separation from their families. Anthropological studies and archaeological findings have also unearthed evidence suggesting that some enslaved women may have secretly taken the lives of their infants. At slave burial grounds, researchers have discovered the remains of infants buried separately from the others. These unusual burials hint at mothers who, in the face of unimaginable anguish, chose to end their children's suffering before it could even begin. Number 3. Children as cargo and the practice of child-breaking. Black children were among the most vulnerable victims of the transatlantic slave trade, treated no differently than commodities. Captured at shockingly young ages, sometimes as young as 5, these children were chained, shipped, and sold without regard for their innocence. Enslaved children were ripped from their families, loaded onto ships like livestock, and transported across the ocean, where they were forced to endure the same brutal conditions as adults. Shipping records and slave ship manifests reveal a grim reality. These documents often listed children alongside other goods, with details like their ages, genders, and even weights noted for prospective buyers. To the traders, these young lives were just numbers, valued solely for the profits they could generate. There was no acknowledgement of their humanity, only the cold calculation of what they were worth. Once these children arrived on plantations, they faced an even darker chapter. Many underwent a process known as child breaking, where they were subjected to relentless physical and psychological abuse to force them into submission. Historical accounts describe children being whipped, starved, and isolated to crush their spirits. This process was designed to strip away any resistance and mold them into obedient laborers. Separation from their parents further deepened the trauma, robbing these children of any sense of family, love, or protection. Abolitionists who documented the horrors of slavery brought attention to these brutal practices. Frederick Douglass, who himself experienced slavery as a child, described the trauma that young enslaved people faced. For slaveholders, breaking a child's spirit was essential to maintaining control, as they feared any sign of resilience or attachment to the family could disrupt their system of exploitation. Here's a reminder to please support us so we can make more videos for you by subscribing to our channel and giving the video a like. We want to build a strong community and we need your support. Let's continue now. Number 4. Human zoos in Europe. As appalling as it may sound today, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, Europeans displayed African men, women, and children in what were known as human zoos. These grotesque exhibitions, especially popular in countries like France, Germany, and Belgium, were a tool used to dehumanize Africans and portray them as savages. This reinforced the colonial ideology that Africans were primitive and in need of European civilization. One of the most infamous exhibitions was the 1889 Paris World Fair, where a village was set up with 400 Africans displayed in mock huts. These individuals were showcased as if they were exotic animals, living in a fabricated environment designed to depict them as backward. Visitors came to gawk at these displays, reinforcing stereotypes and justifying the cruel subjugation of African people under the guise of bringing them progress. The tragic story of Otabenga, a Congolese man, stands as a grim example of this practice taken to an extreme. In 1906, Otabenga was put on display in the Bronx Zoo in New York, where he was kept in the monkey house. Crowds flocked to see him, treating him as an attraction rather than a human being. Number 5. The buck-breaking practice. In the brutal world of Caribbean plantations, particularly in Jamaica and Barbados, slave owners resorted to a cruel tactic known as buck-breaking to crush the spirits of strong-willed enslaved men. This horrifying practice involved publicly abusing a male slave in front of his family and peers to humiliate him, strip away his sense of manhood, and assert absolute dominance. It wasn't just about the physical act. It was psychological warfare meant to break any sign of resistance. By turning these men into symbols of submission, slave owners would instill fear in the entire community, ensuring that others would never dare to rebel. The diaries of Thomas Thistlewood, a notorious British overseer in Jamaica, provide chilling documentation of the sexual abuse that was inflicted on both male and female slaves. Thistlewood meticulously recorded his assaults, revealing how sexual abuse was used as a tool for punishment and control. Historian Trevor Bernard's research into these diaries highlights how enslaved men who attempted to escape or resisted labor were subjected to this brutal form of public humiliation. The trauma was so severe that many survivors lost their sense of self, with oral histories passed down through Caribbean communities telling of men who became isolated and mentally broken, unable to recover from the shame inflicted upon them. Number 6. The Iron Maiden. Punishment devices. Plantation owners in the American South and the Caribbean used iron cages to punish enslaved individuals deemed disobedient. These weren't the spike-filled Iron Maidens of medieval lore, but cages designed to confine the body tightly, causing prolonged pain and psychological suffering. The intent was clear: to instill fear in others who might consider defying the plantation's brutal regime. Former slaves, interviewed during the WPA Slave Narratives Project, recounted how they or others were locked in iron cages, exposed to the elements. Charles Ball, an enslaved man in South Carolina, wrote in his memoir about witnessing fellow slaves confined in these torturous devices for days on end. Victims were left unable to sit, stand, or lie down, leading to muscle spasms, dehydration, and collapse. In extreme cases, enslaved individuals would die from sheer exhaustion or exposure. Similarly, in his account, Solomon Northup, author of 12 Years a Slave, described being kept shackled in a pitch-dark cell for days, highlighting the psychological torment that isolation and restraint inflicted. Number 7. Seasoning with salt in open wounds. After enslaved individuals were whipped, overseers sometimes intensified their suffering by rubbing salt directly into their open wounds. This was not out of concern for infection, but rather to prolong their agony and send a grim message to others. In his autobiography, Olaudah Equiano describes how overseers on Caribbean plantations would use salt and pepper on wounds. The searing pain would bring many to tears and screams, serving as a reminder of the consequences of disobedience. Accounts from Jamaican plantations collected by abolitionists reveal that this practice was particularly common for those caught attempting to escape. The excruciating pain served as a brutal deterrent. Give it a moment and really feel the pain of the black fathers, mothers, and children who went through all these pains every day. Isn't it true that this crushes the hearts? Can anything justify what was done with black slaves? In the comment section right below, let us know what you know about the atrocities inflicted on black slaves during slavery. Would you like us to make more videos? If yes, please support us by subscribing to the Black History Archives and clicking the bell icon. You can check out more videos on our channel too.